All right, board gaming enthusiasts, or I should say dungeon crawling enthusiasts. If you've been following my channel for any amount of time, board gaming occupies a decent-sized amount of hobby time for myself, along with wargaming and Dungeons and Dragons. But within that narrative of board gaming, dungeon crawlers are my thing. Fantasy RPG type games are my thing. Board games, Runebound, Gloomhaven, Descent, Dark Souls. I mean, I love all variations on the dungeon crawling theme. And with the Hero Quest reprint, I've got the original, the reprint, got some custom stuff. This got me thinking, and this got me kind of exploring some of the other titles, because now is the hardest thing when a pre-order is done. You play the waiting game. You got to kind of hang out. And in exploring some of my other titles, this got me thinking, looking at the evolution and the swing of how board games operate. And Bard Sung is also on my mind. Have games with the AI gotten more complex, more unnecessary, or not as good, where they're actually taking down, they're pulling away from the narrative? So the idea of board gaming, role-playing games, dungeon crawls, kind of the holy grail, you had Dungeons and Dragons, or I should say AD&D at the time, and the fantastic aspect of it was the world, the dungeon, and the creation. So it's been this kind of holy grail of, can we get that D&D experience, that dungeon crawling experience, where there's no prep time? You just kind of sit, or smaller amount of prep time. You know, using Hero Quest as an example, you have a very simplified system, and you have the quests, and you can design your own quests, and you kind of go in and do that dungeon crawling type thing. The evolution from there, you know, that existed from the 90s with Hero Quest way up till 2008, 2010 with Descent First Edition. But then we started to see the evolution. We started to see this switch where it was a co-op. So now you had dungeon crawlers, you know, whatever, 10 to 20 dungeon crawlers, that the monsters, the missions, the dungeon, it's automated. Maybe through a set of cards, maybe through just a simple AI like spawn, move, and attack, a simple type of behavioral path outline. Gloomhaven's a great example. Gloomhaven, the AI plays itself based on the cards, based on the activation. And this works pretty well. If we look at Dark Souls, it works pretty well for what it does. And it frees up someone from being the overlord, GM, necromancer, bad guy player. But are we losing something? Are we losing something? And this was funny, jumping back into Hero Quest, looking at, back in the day, some good, some not so good. It was a much younger Fritz. Looking at some of my quests that I wrote, what I was taking a lot into account was the fact that my personality of how I run the monsters. The funny thing about Hero Quest, when monsters spawn, yes, the rooms are a little small, and the heroes can one-punk the monsters. But in places where they can't, nothing says you have to attack with the monsters. You can start running away. You can start moving away. And you'd be surprised how easy it is to divide a party and kind of separate things out and spawn other monsters and bring them forward. So getting more tactical. And this got me thinking, where you're never going to be able to approach, slight footnote in a second, we'll talk about apps, but you're never going to be able to approach the complexity of play of having a human-controlled monster group, having an overlord, having a necromancer, having a GM, you know, going back to Hero Quest, having that ability, especially if they're a really good wargamer or have previous RPG experience and know how to play the monsters. There is something to that. And I feel like with the rush, or I should say the completion of AI-driven stuff, while I appreciate that, because I like to sit down with all my friends, play on the same team. If the glory goes great, I'm going to claim it all. If we die, I'm going to blame it on Joey, and just kind of playing those aspects out. It's nice where we can all play together, but I feel like some of these systems start to get so complex where it takes away from the narrative. I spend a little more time doing bookkeeping or figuring out, okay, wait, this monster activates, where does it move? Okay, what does the card say? But then there's this condition, and there's this interrupt, and this happens. Controlled by an overlord, that person processes everything. So I find myself and we see this with any hobby, you kind of go back and forth, back and forth. Miniature wargaming, you start out with your army, then you buy a second army, then you got to buy another army in case a random friend shows up and they want to play. And you have big games and bigger games, and you get together with your friends. You have massive games with hundreds and hundreds of miniatures. I mean, we recreated the Horus Heresy Siege of Terra on the Holy Walls back in the day. I was representing World Eaters, of course, storming that wall. And we had literally thousands of Marines on the table. Real scale, true scale, playing it out. Then you do that for a while, and you're like, man, I'm burnt out. I want to go back to smaller games. So now you're like, I want Combat Patrol. I want Kill Team. I want 10 figures on the table. So it's natural to kind of jump back and forth. And I realize I'm in that cycle a little bit now where the complexity and ability of a human-controlled opponent, I'm feeling it. I'm feeling that. Jumping back to Hero Quest, it is perfect for that because the rules are simplified enough and played well. You can put some hurt. You can put some bite with those monsters. What do you guys think in terms of the hobby? Because we see more and more of these AI systems. We see more and more of not one versus many, but group co-op play. Is it getting too advanced, too much for its own good? Now, side footnote, and then I'm going to leave it at that. Apps solve that. The app literally runs it, can do unexpected things. You can maybe even code it and program the app to not always make the most optimal move. Put in a luck or a random token, and if that pops up, just do something completely crazy, suddenly attack a random character to add a little bit of berserker flavor in there. And being an app, you don't really see the mechanics behind the scenes. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know how it's going to play out. I can see that creating that in-the-moment experience where it's like, wow, that's really interesting. Downside to that, and I'm not a fan of app play, although I'm on the fence more and more, coming around to it a little bit. I don't like the idea, maybe because I'm longevity with my board games, playing, the original Hero Quest, having titles that I still really enjoy. I don't want to be tied to an app that when the game is not supported, the app is dumped, and now I'm playing on some ancient iPhone to try and figure it out, jump-starting the battery. The game will just become a pile of nothing, a pile of worthlessness. So I realize that there are limitations to it. Not a big fan of apps yet, but that does solve the problem. Or secondary footnote, a system that is really, really tight, really, really well done, and really, really, I'm thinking the word to try to capture it, freaky. Kingdom Death Monster, one of the jewels in my collection. The AI for that, best AI I've ever played. When you go on those hunts and you fight those monsters, they react. The first couple of times I played it, and no spoilers here, KDM, no spoilers. KDM was like, this is crazy. It's like, I'm fighting the White Lion. It's the first encounter. And this thing with the AI and how it reacts to hits and criticals, it's so slick. I felt like, is someone in the next room, beaming in commands to this thing? Because it really felt like I was fighting this miniature. It really felt like I was fighting the monster. And I'm like, I don't know what to make of this. So I do realize when a system has the duality of being streamlined, being tight, and being complex, it's seamless. It's flawless. I've yet to play, and I'm open to recommendations, I've yet to play an AI game that is as sophisticated as KDM. If all solo games were like that, then we wouldn't need KDM, but that would be a different story. Your thoughts, where are you kind of leaning to? And maybe I'm just tripping on Hero Quest right now because we're doing the long wait. Not that I want to kind of fast forward a year, but yeah, it's going to be a wait. But looking at this idea of AI type games, one versus many versus AI.